Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and please let me know if you can see it. Which screen am I going to share? I think I'll share this one. If I do this. Right, I'm hoping by doing that you can see the slides.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty, so this is lesson 3, advising a cloud design and migration. This will be a recap of stuff that you've already learned, as well as introducing some new concepts. So there might be stuff that you are familiar with and stuff that you have not seen and might want additional explanation. And if so, please raise your hand. Okay. Also my first time running these slides, so please bear with me. So this is what we're covering on today's session. So relate cloud concepts to cloud design and migration. That's something that we've seen already. Cloud design, we're going to go through this in a few minutes. Cloud assessments, manage cloud design, compare cloud migration approaches, and lastly, identify benefits and solutions for cloud services. Okay, so topic A. Oh, I've still got people coming in, so bear with me. I might have to pause and stop. It's throwing me off. So topic A, relate cloud concepts to cloud design and migration. First point here around explain cloud principles. Okay, let's jump straight into this. So as I previously mentioned, this is going to be kind of a recap. Probably the first initial slides are going to be a recap of stuff that we've already covered in the previous sessions, and then some stuff will be completely new concepts. So let's look firstly at cloud design and migration and the 5 cloud characteristics. That we've kind of briefly touched upon this in the previous sessions. On demand, self-service, cloud design must recognize that business units may deploy service when needed. That's something that we've covered in terms of the desire or requirements that an organization might have in terms of moving their assets to cloud. Oh, no, let's go back one. And what exactly is required of that cloud design. Broad network access. So looking at, there will be a significant increase in internet traffic, and internet connectivity must be designed with high availability in mind. High availability is a concept we're going to go into more detail around, but specifically around this increase in network traffic, you have to consider those when designing your cloud in terms of how many assets you'll have on network, and additionally, if you have the capacity to maintain all these devices. Resource pooling. Not all business resources are a good fit for how cloud service providers distribute workloads. Again, that might be something that an organization would need to consider. For example, cloud service providers, they take advantage of economies of scale and how they distribute their workloads of their customers across data centers hardware. Rapid elasticity. Cloud design should take advantage of resource scalability. I know scalability was a concept believe we covered in the last session in terms of being able to, scale your environments by increasing them as such. And that would fall into, reasons as you're moving to the cloud. I'm not too sure if we've covered this in a previous session, but in terms of scaling, it's actually quite difficult to scale in a physical on-prem data center. That would mean purchasing, maintaining physical devices. You have to consider legacy and management of these devices, which can have a high kind of management overhead in terms of the admin, the costing, and it just might be an overall better financial decision for organizations to move assets to the cloud and move that kind of responsibility over to a third party. Lastly, measure services. Organizations can achieve a better understanding of how resources are used, reported, and billed. So I think we covered kind of, CapEx, OpEx. I think this is kind of alluding to that aspect of, billing and costing and really working out for the organization what would be the best fit. Now, moving on to the 3 cloud service models. I know that I believe this has been covered in the previous session. So we've got the 3 cloud models here: software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Now, this is something that if the content that we haven't provided here is not enough, that you do go outside and do some more research around this. There is so much information out there about these 3 cloud models, because they're all very different. So for example, let's look at SaaS. I know last week we looked at kind of software licensing and who is responsible for kind of managing those software licenses. And this could be potentially an alternative. So instead of purchasing and maintaining a software in-house, making sure you've got the updates, etc., you might instead use software as a service, whereby that responsibility is with that third party, and all you're essentially doing is using their cloud service. But it depends what services that you want on premise or what you desire to have in the cloud. I think software as a service is a great option for organizations, especially those who have a international team, especially for those who work remotely and access these resources. It's very helpful to organizations that have services in the cloud that can be pretty much accessed from wherever, your device, wherever you are in the world. So that's software as a service, platform as a service. So looking at the development team can have more consistent development environments. So for example, just utilizing different tools. I was going to say GitHub, but I will cover that later on. And lastly, infrastructure as a service. So not every physical server can or should be migrated to the cloud, to a cloud-based virtual machine. So, and that's something I was alluding to earlier. So just based on the organization's strategy, there might be some services that you feel are necessary to be moved to the cloud, but not all services, depending on its criticality, its sensitivity, to the organization, and whether you want to put that responsibility into a third party's hands. I know it's not covered in this course. I don't believe it's covered, but I would encourage you, I'm going to put it in the chat. I would encourage you to look at the, always jump slides, to look at the shared responsibility model. I'll put that in the chat. Hold on. And that would kind of help you make the decisions around, what speaking from an organizational perspective, what an organization should take responsibility for versus what a third party, or you would allow a third party to kind of manage on your behalf. Okay. I think I can see the chat from here. So if I'm kind of walking through stuff, if you want additional explanation, please just stop me or chat out. I think that would be the easiest thing to do. So for cloud deployment models, so we've got private cloud, public cloud, community cloud, and hybrid cloud. So firstly, looking at private cloud. So the private cloud designs offer or differ from public cloud designs in that your organization or organizations can retain control of the physical data center in a private cloud. And the design process is also completely under the control of that company. So private cloud, completely up to the organization how they want to design and maintain their cloud. But public, for example, this would be designing a public cloud deployment or migration, which should be done in conjunction with the cloud service provider. And the cloud service provider will have tools and documentations to aid you in this process. And the security and availability must also be integrated into the design. Thirdly, we have the community cloud. So the design of a community cloud environment must take into account the needs of each participating organization, because this is more of a kind of shared environment. And the design team should include members from each organization. And lastly, hybrid cloud. So the design of the hybrid cloud solution begins with establishing which services will be provided in the private cloud and which will be provided in the public or community cloud. The design must also take into account the internet connectivity between the private cloud deployment and the public community portion. So moving on, we have our first activity. I hope that all made sense. Just to quickly recap, we went through quickly just the 5 cloud characteristics, the 3 cloud service models. These are imperative to understand for the exam. So I would definitely make sure that we understand these. So 5 cloud characteristics, 3 cloud service models, and the 4 cloud deployment models. We've got a question in the chat. So no question is a silly question. It really depends on the organization. If I go back, let's see, yeah, it really depends on the organization and the strategy. I think ultimately it really will boil down to cost. I think ideally all organizations want to maintain private cloud. Well, depending on, again, your strategy as an organization, but ultimately it will come down to cost of having private cloud, costs of maintaining private cloud. And it depends on what you're hosting. Depending on the data that you're maintaining, the classification and sensitivity of that data, can you put it in the public cloud? Depends. All depends on the organization and the organization's needs. Yeah, that's what I would say. I believe there probably is more kind of strengths and limitations of each. It's not something that we're covering on this course or on these slides. So I don't necessarily have it to hand. Just reading questions in the chat. Yes, that was which one did I say? I've seen your question there, Afia, but that wouldn't be the case for all models. Yeah, we've got a question. We've got one person with their hand raised. Do you want to answer your question?
Yeah.
Your question? Yeah, sure.
I was going to say, I might know just a little bit about the community cloud. So I wanted to say, for example, the security features are probably, I'll say, not as good as a private cloud. So that goes back to especially what sort of data is going to be shared there. Obviously, because it's community, it's going to be something, might be where they put things like, let's say, for example, hospitals, trusts, they would not be sharing things like patient data or medical data over such cloud. So there'll be things like frameworks, things that, bind them together, such as regulatory bodies or compliance laws or things you have to do, or latest trends in, or whatever is going on, or things even like public things relating to public health information, something general, as well as it's probably not a place where where there'll be collaboration. I mean, where they're going to be talking of really sensitive things. And I also know that I know we mentioned this in one of our classes in terms of things like their bandwidth, like the strength of the bandwidth it won't be as great. So maybe that could be maybe maybe that could be what you could call limitations for the community cloud.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for your contribution. That's definitely kind of limitations of that cloud model. Although it's just not something that I'm covering at the moment. And it's great that you did mention around health information, because that's something that we will cover later on in the course.
Okay, sorry, just that we might have a little bit clarity to the acts. In terms of cloud security, we're actually looking at shared interests of some set of people, like a group of IT companies saying that we want to have our own domain, want to have our own services So this set of people coming together to have or to buy into either cloud or either private or public or whatever it is, facility or model they want to key into to serve their purpose. That's basically what community cloud is all about. So it's just, and they determine what happens within that space, because it's like being in an estate, you are in an estate named ABC. So that ABC covers everybody in that estate, because by virtue of what them buying into that estate, they're actually benefiting from one another. So that's what community cloud just does, and it helps to unify the kind of, they have a peer oversight. They could appoint a supervisor, they could appoint a chairman, a secretary, treasury, like just like that, to create a community that that actually harmonize and key into their objective to serve them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Yeah, this is an open forum. If anybody else in the kind of chat feels that they have a kind of relevant contribution that will kind of help the group or aid the group, please feel free to shout out or drop a message in the chat. Thank you. Okay, so moving on. Sorry, we've got so much to cover. So this is the first activity. Oh, we've got another question. Yes. Sorry, I've lost it. I don't know who raised their hand just now. Okay, no problem. So first activity, let's look. Discuss how cloud concepts relate to cloud design and migration. So you are acting as a business analyst on your organization's cloud migration team. A co-worker approaches you with a question regarding how cloud migration might help the marketing department. Specifically, the marketing department sees a very significant increase in resource utilization in the second and fourth quarters of the year, with the first and third quarters being relatively low utilization. What cloud attributes might help answer your co-worker's question? Feel free to shout out or drop some.
I'll be thinking of rapid elasticity, because more like, this is a case whereby the cloud-based resources can be adjusted throughout the year. So in the case of scaling out, and we talked about scaling out and scaling up, if I'm right. And so in this case, maybe in the second and third quarters of the year, there's an increase. I'll assume probably maybe this Christmas, Easter, and that kind of thing. Let's assume this is like a retail store. Oh yeah, it says marketing department. So these are the times where you've got sales or during sales, and there's an increase in people actually going on the site to buy things. And while in the first and third quarters things are relatively slow, so I think it's this will be very useful in terms of if we move our resources to the cloud, we're able to add more resources to adjust, to adapt to our needs as needed. And if we need to scale down as well, we can do that. So enabling effective utilization of resources, as well as also, I think measured services, someone also mentioned that comes into view in terms of where, we only get billed for what we use. So we're actually saving money, and yes, economies of scales.
Yeah, that's a good approach, I believe. I can see another rapid elasticity measured services in the chat. So let's see. You can't see the answer there. Hold on 1 second. Okay, here we go. So yeah, answers may vary, but include on-demand service, elasticity, and measured services. So all were correct. Let me see for the next discussion. So You're a business analyst on your organization's cloud migration team and are approached by one of the managers at your organization. The manager comments that each department manages its own software and that there are often problems with application versions and compatibility. What cloud service model might help standardize the organization's environment?
I think software as a service, because organizations can rethink how their software is being managed.
Yep, I'm seeing SaaS on demand. Okay, I think a lot of people have gone for SaaS. Again, as additional kind of reading and just understanding, looking at that shared responsibility model would really help with understanding the kind of cloud models and who would be responsible for what, etc. Let's see. Yeah, we've got here software as a service. So yeah, all were correct. So let's look. Managers comments at each comes application, but what kind of standardized organization's environment? Yeah, software as a service. I think that would be so much easier to manage in terms of looking at each department, ensuring that they're maintaining the same software versions. And in terms of accessibility, it would be easy for all the different departments to kind of use that one kind of standardized service. Okay, right, moving on. So now we're moving on to topic B, use cloud assessments. So we'll be covering kind of these points over the next few slides. Again, so these, as I mentioned, these services, these sessions are just kind of going over stuff that hopefully you've covered in your own personal time, and this is just an opportunity to kind of go over them. So looking at cloud migration phases, we're going to look individually at these phases here. So discovery of resources, suitability of resources for cloud deployment, something that we've just discussed around, data sensitivity, whether it's health information, mapping of applications and services to the cloud, migration of services and applications to the cloud, operational support of cloud services, which you've already covered. Again, that's going back to the shared responsibility model. I might bring that up quickly just so I can kind of talk to that. Hopefully I'll get the opportunity to do that. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm going to try and show you. I think I stopped sharing the screen, but I want to show you again. Just take 2 minutes to kind of show you. Hopefully you can see the screen. I just wanted to kind of use this because this will help kind of understand, because through my own personal experiences, this is how I've understood the need to kind of move to cloud or not. What model you adopt or not is based on the requirements of the organization. So as you can see, orange is the cloud customer, blue is the cloud provider. That would be your third party. So When you're on premise, everything's your responsibility, from security, infrastructure, network controls, all those are your responsibility. Whereas as you move across, more and more responsibility is handed over to that third party. And this is really depending on the requirements of that organization and what your kind of risk appetite is. That's how I've understood this model. I think this would be really useful. I've just Googled shared responsibility model. So please have a look at this. I think this will really help to put things into context. Yeah, I just thought I'd share that. Hopefully you can you see the screen? Hopefully. Okay, back to normality. Sorry about that. Just thought it would be a really useful thing to show you. Let's go back to sharing my screen. Okay. Yep, sorry, I just getting mixed up now. This is just an example, honestly. I just Googled. Oh, hold on 1 second. I don't know what I'm sharing.
Hey, Antonia, I think Effie's already put it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So I'm getting lost anytime yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Anytime I jump between screens, I get lost. But I really do think it aids understanding. So please do use that resource. Right, I am sharing this screen. I don't want this to go bigger. How can I? Oh. We are on this. We were on cloud migration phases. So let's look at what is a cloud assessment. So a cloud assessment is one of the earliest steps in the cloud design process. So the purpose of an assessment is to determine which portions of the business are ready for cloud deployment and which need attention before migrating. And this will go through kind of the business relationships with cloud vendors. So I've jumped ahead when I shared that shared responsibility model, but it really helps the understanding. And then whether you go down private or public is, again, down to your kind of requirements and needs of the organization. So let's look deeper into cloud assessments. So it's kind of I would say a feasibility study for your cloud deployment. So firstly, a deliberate and step-by-step examination of the organization's readiness for cloud migration. So it takes into account the following things: cloud characteristics, cloud service models, and cloud deployment models, which we have just covered. So a cloud assessment is essentially feasibility. You know, one of the earliest steps that you would do during your cloud design process. And again, we've covered those service and deployment models in the previous slides. So let's look. This is some additional details. So your cloud assessment, you're looking at your feasibility study. So look, this is looking at your business requirements, your IT infrastructure, applications and related dependencies, measuring network capability. So going back to what we kind of mentioned earlier around the capacity, whether it can handle all your network devices at one time, high availability is something that we're going to cover later on. That's something that you want to consider definitely within your cloud design. And then here we go, what we mentioned earlier, health information. Is this something that your organization maintains? So for example, organizations such as, the NHS, we've got payment card industry, so the likes of MasterCard, or the other kind of card providers, Sarbanes-Oxley. This is something that I'm not too sure if you're familiar with, but these are kind of regulatory compliances, and this will effectively dictate how you manage and protect your data, and ultimately we'll look at how data is stored, etc. So we're going to cover these in more detail, but these might include, the security, compliance, specifications, specifically PCI. There are certain security requirements. I have a security background, so I'm going to be biased and always probably give examples from a security perspective. But for PCI, if your organization maintains PCI information, there's going to be certain requirements that you need to meet, and you might be audited on that, which means that somebody from an external organization, from a third-party organization, might come in to your business and look at the security controls or look at the controls that you maintain, and that needs to be built into your cloud design. How are you ensuring that you are managing and protecting this PCI information? And for those who are not familiar with PCI, payment card information, we're talking customer data, we're talking personal data. It's names, addresses, it's card information, it's your 16-digit, it's your security, 3-digit security code on the back. That's all that information that we share with organizations to, make payments, have those kind of financial transactions. And those organizations have a responsibility to ensure that once we share that information, it is protected. Okay, IT infrastructure. So we're looking at cloud design. So in my personal experience, where I'm doing a project, for example, where they have a requirement to move to the cloud, it's firstly assessing, what does your current IT infrastructure look like, and determine, like we just mentioned, its readiness for cloud migration. And this might include your hardware, your servers, looking at how much data is contained on these assets, and how much is required to be moved to the cloud. Specifically, infrastructure as a service solutions in the cloud are entirely virtualized, virtualization based. So your infrastructure must support efficient virtualization technologies. So we've got a few points there: your hardware assessment, your virtualization and orchestration. So looking at streamline, standardize, and simplify the deployment process. Ideally, you want it to be a really smooth transition, to kind of simplify the deployment process. But it depends. Using this kind of cloud assessment will help determine how to do that. So let's move on to, we've covered IT infrastructure. Let's move on to orchestration. So this was the last point that we just covered in terms of that, simplifying the deployment process. So complete deployment of a service from virtual machine to end user access. So when we discuss, moving from on-prem to the cloud, it's not just we're moving assets. This is a complete culture shift for a lot of organizations, because you're ultimately changing how the users will access their assets, how the users will, access their data. This might require you to implement new security features. For example, accessing your cloud resources might require a different username and password at the basic level. I'm just using that as an example. Or you might want to utilize additional security features such as multi-factor authentication, which might be an embedded thing into your cloud deployment, which might be considered. They've mentioned here automation of the following steps. So deployment of your virtual machine, that can be automated. Installation of your operating system, such as RHEL, configuration and patching of the operating system. Now, that's definitely something that you want to be automated, especially when it comes to security fixes. Patches, those are something that, once the patch is released, you want that to be deployed as soon as possible, as soon as it's available. So you want that process to be automated. Installation and configuration of any supporting softwares, and granting access granted to user to the virtual machine. And that's something that I kind of mentioned earlier around, that complete culture shift, and giving users access. So this is really the complete deployment process from beginning to end, from infrastructure to the end user. And this is essentially what it would look like. So orchestration is the entire series of automated steps. So that VM template that would come up in your design, what requirements do you have for that? Installing the OS, patching and configuring the OS, installing and configuring, and then ultimately, once your model is ready and you're ready to go live, ultimately allowing user access. So additional assessment components. So this is again, I have a security background, so this is where my mind is going to. IT infrastructure must be baselined. And what we mean by that is essentially ensuring that there is a consistent level of hardware and operating systems that are deployed. So for example, all servers must have 16 gigs or more, and will have Windows Server 12 or Red Hat RHEL 7 installed. So that is the baseline that an organization might set. They might enforce that within their policies, but it's ensuring that they don't have kind of legacy applications or assets within the organization. And that might be widespread across the organization to say, this is the baseline. All our servers must have this amount of storage and must be at this version of this application. Second point there, we have application and their dependencies, which will also be included in the feasibility study. Is it supported? So I've seen a lot of cases whereby an organization might want to upgrade to the latest software version, but maybe their infrastructure doesn't support it due to it being an outdated version, or it not having the storage capacity to maintain and store that updated version. Yeah, I've seen organizations with old kind of old applications that we're talking 15, 20 years old, that in its origination were not designed to be moved to the cloud. So that, again, that's another feasibility that you have to consider. And then going back to my original point around the desires of the organization, there are certain things that you just can't move to the cloud because maybe it's a legacy application and it's there's no updated version, there's no SaaS version of the application, and therefore there's no requirement or no option for it to move to the cloud. But it's common within organizations that you won't migrate all of your assets to the cloud, but you want to, it depends on the organization. Ideally, for some, it might be, let's move the majority, because we find it easier to maintain it that way, especially with that shared responsibility model. There's a lot that the third party will be responsible for, and we just pay them a fee and they can take care of it. Like going to the mechanics, for example, when I'm doing my MOT, I can get, even though I can't do the MOT myself, but they're going to check my car, they're going to check it's okay, and I'm putting my car essentially in the third party's hands, that mechanic's hands, to ensure that my car is safe and ready for the road. And lastly, here we have network functionality, so must support higher availability and more traffic than in an on-premise deployment. High availability, we're going to go into a bit more detail later on. But the network, as we kind of previously mentioned, there's certain features that you want your network to maintain. So the bandwidth, performance, reliability, and the security of the internet connection must be evaluated. Depending on your organization's requirements, whether you need high bandwidth, low bandwidth, again, depending on, it's different for every organization. Got an example here. So Microsoft recommends that branch office locations connect directly to Office 365 data centers rather than to their traffic funneled through the main headquarters, which again, this is a vendor proposing, and I think this is something that we're going to cover as well. So as much as you as an organization might have your cloud designs, you will have inputs from your cloud vendors how best to manage your assets. Oh. Documentation, so must be current and accurate, may include diagrams of physical, logical network paths, relationships of data applications, and physical security measures. So, for example, having documentation before the cloud design and migration process begins makes that process a lot simpler. I'm not too sure if you've seen any tools or software that's used to map out your physical or logical network paths, but historically on projects I've seen people use Microsoft Visio. It's really good for kind of mapping out your assets and mapping out that network, and really having that as a visual tool to help you with your network designs. And ensuring that those are kept up to date and current. Last thing that you want to do is migrate and your map only reflects 90% of your assets and you've left some out. That's the worst thing that you could do. Key stakeholders. Again, going back to what I just mentioned about the vendors being the providers of your applications. Again, they are a stakeholder and potentially might have specific requirements that you have to meet. And there might be other stakeholders that have specific concerns, influence on the project, and levels of interest. So let's see. Working with key stakeholders. So firstly, kind of identifying, can I jump to the next slide? Because they have a really cool map here of kind of key stakeholders. I should probably, 1 second. Okay. Yeah, really important to identify your key stakeholders. Let's have a look. So we've got one as a key stakeholder, your cloud team, customers, end users, and the executive managers, which will kind of ultimately make the decisions about the organization. Organize stakeholders into groups. So you can see there the cloud team kind of moved into IT cloud team operations and management. And they will be making these following decisions. Executive teams, organized into kind of the management structure, will be making decisions around what availability and quality cost is required, etc. And these flow down into additional information, timelines, outages, requirements, which then flows down into establishing a means of communication. So discussing these regularly at the quarterly meetings, operations discussing via a monthly update email, and lastly, IT discussing at a daily status update meeting, and ensuring those conversations are happening to ensure that all your stakeholders are informed in some way. As I previously mentioned, moving from on-prem to cloud is a major disruption to the organization. It's a big shift, and all your employees as such need to be informed about what's happening with clear communication about the shift and change to make the transition a lot smoother. Oh. Okay, point of contact. So a single point of contact for any cloud migration questions is useful. Having two-way communication between stakeholders and the cloud team. Yeah, so having someone as a point of contact to bring questions to the cloud team, allowing the cloud team to communicate outward to stakeholders is really useful. I think for me personally, from my own personal experience, moving to the cloud, moving an asset to the cloud is a major project, major project. So ensuring communication is maintained across all your stakeholders is just imperative. Gap analysis. So let's see here. So the gap analysis, I guess it's and I think this is not kind of technology specific. Gap analysis takes places across many different sectors. Doesn't necessarily have to be IT or technology. But in this case, it's a deliberate. It's a deliberate study of whether IT is being used to its fullest potential. And there may be a gap in current business use of a cloud service versus potential benefits of the service. So the gap may occur from technology perspective or from a business perspective, or for example, some businesses will already have begun moving services and applications to the cloud before an enterprise-wide mandate has been established. So someone across the organization might have a great idea in terms of, yeah, let's move these things to the cloud, but they may not have a policy or a standard of how these assets will be maintained once in the cloud. And it won't be the cloud provider who are going to inform the organizations of how to do this. But in these situations, it's important for organizations to have adequate planning and design in place. Okay. So let's see, just I know earlier I mentioned around gap analysis in terms of using those cloud resources. So we've got two aspects that we're covering here, the technology knowledge gap and the business knowledge gap. So firstly, we have the technology knowledge gap, which can occur very quickly. Cloud services are rapidly evolving, as you may know. You know, versions to specific software or assets can be outdated within kind of a few years. So it's really important to ensure that you want to, ideally the goal would be to close as much as possible that technical knowledge gap. And by doing this, you would kind of recognize that IT staff are very proficient with their on-prem services and will require a great deal of education when it comes to cloud services. So that might be through training, upskilling, and that might be to specific IT staff across the organization, or it might be to your whole organization, depending on how big it is or small. And that would be for technical knowledge gaps, but business knowledge gaps, which can also kind of relate to the cloud, but as you can see there, it's mentioning kind of CapEx, OpEx, which we kind of mentioned in the last session. There might be some changes from kind of traditional IT models. But ultimately, it will ensure that the cloud services of the organization is paying and being utilized and optimized. That's ultimately where we want to get to. Okay, cloud assessments and managed service providers. So managed service providers can be particularly helpful during the assessment phase. Managed service providers relate to your organization's current position to services available from the cloud service providers. MSPs, so they're sometimes called employee experts, whose role is to relate the cloud service design and migrate process to your organization's specific needs. So your IT staff may not necessarily have the resources or the mandate with such knowledge. So ultimately, it might be easier just to clarify this point, when you're moving to the cloud, there might be technical knowledge gap in your current staff and business knowledge gaps. And how you want to combat that ultimately would be through MSPs. So your managed service provider would be there on hand to do these 1, 2, 3 points. So managed service providers are aware of common pitfalls and problems. So they will have that expert knowledge to bring to the table. So, where we don't necessarily have the knowledge, we might want to outsource and bring that knowledge in, can be helpful during the assessment phase and can employ experts in design and migration. So you're not necessarily struggling to do it and you're getting it right first time. Again, there might be a cost implication with this, but there has to be a cost benefit analysis here as to, should we do it ourselves at a cheaper rate and mess it up? Or should we employ an MSP to come in with their expert knowledge and potentially get it right first time, and which we would ultimately save money on, contractors maybe that would help us. Interesting. So I just had a question in the chat. So let me go back. Not necessarily. I don't have an example of the point of contact, but I would imagine here it would be the likes of maybe a program manager. On this course, they haven't given me any examples of what this person would do, but from my own experience, this would be the likes of a program manager or your CTO within the organization that is aware of the technology in the organization, aware of the legacy technology that we have, and also moving forward the desired strategy for the organization. Yeah, project manager, program manager. I was just thinking of somebody who sits at the top that would be aware of overarching everything. For me, when I'm doing these sorts of projects, it would be, major, it's not even small projects, it's major programs which would incorporate many small projects within it. So yeah, program manager, project manager, CTO, somebody who would be aware and have great in-depth knowledge of the organization. But in terms of, it seems like this is kind of an intermediary person that is aside from a employee, but is not a cloud team. So they're not the third party and they're not an employee kind of doing the day-to-day work. So it seems to be an intermediary person, but yeah, maybe a contractor that's come in specifically. So we've done gap analysis, MSPs, we're now looking at evaluations. So after you've completed your cloud assessment, it's time to choose one or more of the cloud service providers. So your organization might require specific criteria for selection during the evaluation process. So this criteria will be defined within the request for information, your RFI, but may be more detailed than that document can support. And there are several ways to establish whether a specific vendor, so going back to what I was saying earlier in terms of your vendor kind of dictating how you operate and how you do your cloud design. So then your specific vendor or service will meet your organization's requirements. So the business will define criteria for success. That will be responsibility of the business to specify how to test that criteria. Some ways of verifying success include pilot programs, proof of concepts, proof of value studies. I think proof of concept is an ideal way to go because these are generally a short space of time. You might want to move one low criticality asset to the cloud and see how that performs. And then take it from there. Yeah. Proof of concept is a good thing to do. Because you're really kind of testing out whether this is going to work or not. And if it doesn't work, you're ultimately saving the business money. Ultimately, you don't want to spend too much money and have it fail. Right. Let's look deeper into these. Oh, we've got a question. Oh, I lost. Did I? I could see a hand, but not a question. Nope. Okay. If you do want to ask a question, please just shout out. I can see the chat, but
can I go ahead?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask, in terms of the cloud migration we're looking at, are we just looking at the cloud migration or we're looking at the cloud security alongside the migration in terms of assessments and the likes of it? Because from what I see, we're actually looking at the physical migration, not the totality of the migration in terms of looking at all features that actually makes up the migration. I don't know if I'm wrong. Just give me a little clarity to that.
Yeah, sure. So this, we will be covering aspects of kind of your security requirements, your features, etc. But just generally, this is cloud, looking at, cloud infrastructure, cloud architecture, but we will consider security features along the lines, but it's not specific on the security features, if that makes sense.
That's fine. Thank you.
All right. Right. So earlier we just mentioned the pilot program. So this is looking at, is it going to work? Is it going to not? Small scale project, tests, logistics, prove value, and reveal weaknesses. All right. What's working? What's not? Is it going to work for us? Are we going to lose money? Are we going to save money? Let's really test this out and see if it's beneficial for our business. And that's what you want to achieve with a pilot program. So your organization might wish to establish a pilot program following the selection of a vendor after you've gone through your RFP process and assess that specific vendor. But this will be a very small pilot. You don't want to spend too much money. You don't mind, risking or investing some financial aspects into it, but you don't want it to be an overburden cost to the organization. And you might want to follow these specific steps. Objectives, participants, test plan, mechanism. I won't read those all out. I think I'm behind time. My apologies, I am behind time. We are finishing bang on 8. I know I've been talking for a while. I might take a 5-minute break. Let me see our slide. Oh, hold on 1 second. Sorry, I've jumped ahead. Still got some more slides to do. I'm gonna go on for a few more minutes and then I'll decide where I want to take a break, probably on the next topic. If you want a break, or if you feel like you need a break, please let me know. Okay, success criteria. So if we're using a pilot program to test or to run a feasibility study, what is going to be the success criteria? So we're looking at KPIs to determine whether a pilot program was successful, because ultimately, what would be the point of running it in the first place? But the organization has to determine what those KPIs are, what those key performance indicators are, measuring whether or not these KPIs were satisfied to help determine the success or failure of the program. And the success or failure of the program ultimately will help the decision-making for the organization. Was it determined that it's of value for the organization or not? Okay, I'm going to take a break after our next activity because I feel like my throat is getting dry. I need some water. So we've got a few slides left and then I will take 5 minutes and then come back. So proof of concept and proof of value. So I think we've run through this so many times now. Ultimately, proof of concept confirms the functionality of the deployment is successful. So for example, proof of concept to report for a cloud service migration. These criteria might include whether the cloud service can be reached via all client types in the organization, such as, how do you access your cloud service? Like what I mentioned earlier, it's down to the user we have to test. So can they use their tablets? Can they use their phones, laptops, etc. What devices are having issues accessing this service? Proof of value. It's more difficult to measure because ultimately, by employing these cloud services, there might be a cost saving, but it's not an immediate saving. It might be, something that is realized over a long length of time. But it establishes whether the deployment provides value to the business. Now, that value can be determined as a cost saving, time saving, extended or additional services that were previously unavailable, or other criteria that that are meaningful to your organization. For example, in an infrastructure as a service deployment, the value might be defined as time saving related to the deployment of virtual machines, or the traditional deployment of a physical server operating system, security patches, and basic configuration might be a long, lengthy 20 hours. So I know, I've seen organizations that have gone from not using the cloud to then moving to completely cloud. And it means that ultimately that their organization, their staff can work from home, for example. And that's something that they couldn't do before. And that's the value, that flexibility in working, that's where an organization might see their value. And it might not necessarily be a cost saving, but it might improve the morale across your employees, which is ultimately where you wanted to see the value. Benchmarks. So these are a way of businesses estimating the results of a given change. So a business may compare its current results against industry results, which then indicates if businesses seem to be well aligned with the rest of the industry. Benchmarks may also be used with processes by comparing processes against industry best practice, and businesses can identify whether they deviate and then decide whether adjustments are required to its policies. And I've seen this. You might want to do this benchmark. Depends on your deployment and when you have decided to do this benchmarking. Ideally, we want to do it before you've invested any money. It's always money. It's always cost. Organizations don't care if ultimately all their staff get to work from home. It's always a cost saving is probably one of the most beneficial things to an organization. Yes, they have to consider morale of the employees. Yes, they have to consider security features, but ultimately nothing would be more important than an organization than saving costs or cost savings. So guidelines, we've got cloud assessments, which are used to determine how to prepare an organization for cloud migration. Baselines, which we've mentioned, provide a minimum standard of hardware, operating system, and patches. Network capabilities, these are all requirements that we've just kind of went through. Application readiness, can my legacy application, which was built 20 years ago, can this move to the cloud? Is that feasible? Legacy and custom, yeah, I just mentioned legacy applications. Current and accurate documentation is essential. We just mentioned, mapping out your physical, logical network using tools such as Microsoft Visio. Looking at key stakeholders, having your point of contact, running a feasibility study. Is this going to be a financial benefit? Gap analysis, we looked at those business knowledge versus technical knowledge. Where are the gaps? And how do I fill those gaps? Do I need third parties? Do I need additional resources? Do I need to outsource some work? Pilot programs, running to ensure that I ultimately will see the value, potentially. Identifying any weaknesses, success criteria, what are those KPIs? How do I know I'm being successful? I'm running proof of concepts to confirm the functionality of the cloud service, proof of value, where is the value for the organization? Is it financial? Is it kind of non-monetary value, intrinsic of the employee? And managed service providers ultimately is something that you can consider. Although that might be a cost attached. Again, that might be a cost benefit analysis that an organization will have to do in order to see whether having an MSP is beneficial. Okay, I've spoken a lot. Any questions before we just do these activities? We've got a few more slides left. I have got a dead stop at 8 o'clock, so I cannot go any longer, but I'm hoping. No questions? Okay, I will continue to move on then. So, which of the following best describes a virtual machine? Okay, I think I might have to. Oh, no. So I think of these options, you pick one. Please use the chat. People are saying D, number 4. So software as a service. No. A server configured by orchestration. An allocation of a physical service that is treated as an actual server. The hardware that cloud serves. Okay, let's see the answer. Okay, hold on a second. A lot of you were right, the last one. D, number 4, 0.4, whatever, but that is the correct. So virtual machine, best reflective here of a virtual machine would be the allocation of physical server resources that's treated as if it was an actual server. Okay. Even though I don't think I covered the definition of a virtual machine, but it seems like that would be beneficial knowledge to have. So if you can go off and maybe it was covered in the last session, kind of what is virtual machine. VMware offer some really great resources around virtual machines and the cloud deployment models. Okay, perfect's been covered. Okay, let's see, true or false, orchestration, which we've just covered, refers to the automation of multiple steps in a deployment process. Remember, it was to kind of simplify the deployment, if that helps. True, true, true. Let's see. And the answer is true. Well done. Yeah, we covered orchestration, and that was to ultimately simplify that deployment process. So making things easier, which automation always does. Okay, which of the following best describes the purpose of gap analysis, which we've just covered as well? Hold on, have I done this correct? Yes, I have. So we looked at 2 areas. Yep, okay. I think point 3 could have like thrown you off because it mentioned technical knowledge, but ultimately when it's incorporating both technical and business knowledge, it would be the gap between the business's current understanding of the cloud, the level of understanding needed to optimize it as it's relating to the business practices. Okay, which of the following best describes a proof of concept? Successful deployment of certificate that validates a cloud service, a report that shows. Yeah, I would agree. A, based on what we've just covered. There's a lot of questions here. Sorry. So this is the last one, promise. Before a cloud deployment.
Usually go through them.
Sorry?
We don't usually go through all of the questions if there's not enough time.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, because there isn't enough time, to be honest. I was just trying to get through them. But yeah, this one we'll just have to proof of value, whatever that was. Okay, perfect. I am going to take 5 minutes and I'm hoping that I'm going to get through the rest of the slides. So I will meet back here at 9:40. I need to grab some water. 9:40, sorry, 1940 hours. Okay, so covering the last aspect, we're hoping to finish on time at 8 o'clock. So this is topic C, managed cloud design. So we're going to be looking at, to summarize important aspects of cloud design. So we've covered so many features just now in terms of your feasibility studies, running a proof of concept, really testing out if your cloud design meets the desired expectations and provides the value that the organization wants. So a successful cloud design accounts for the cloud deployment models and when it's appropriate to use each model. The design also includes service level definitions. Finally, disaster mitigation should be built into the design. This mitigation should specifically address recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives, which is something that we will cover later on in a few slides. I'm going to try and run through these as quickly, but as slow as possible, that we still kind of understand what's going on. Okay, I've got a link here, which might be beneficial for you to go to. I think someone's on, has taken their mute off. I'm going to try and mute this person. Everyone's muted. Okay, perfectly fine. Let me drop this into the chat. Hold on 1 second. Oh no, I don't think that worked. Why didn't that work? Anyway, copy that, paste that into your web browser. So essentially, that is just looking at kind of your initial design concepts. So your design should leverage the characteristics of cloud computing. It should also reflect the service orientation approach, something that may be a significant change to your organization. The design recognizes the distributed nature of cloud services and the idea that the web is a platform to enable other services in addition to service itself. Software as a service and its software as a service is often independent of these devices from which it is accessed. Okay, so let's move on swiftly. Design and cloud models, something that we've just covered. Your design must recognize when
Sorry, before you go for that, the URL you actually shared, are we made to look at?
Sorry, you got cut off there.
The URL you shared actually is just showing like a page with requesting for a demo. I wanted to know what you wanted us to look at in terms of a pointer to that aspect.
Yeah, this was looking at cloud design, concepts of cloud design. Has it not brought you to the right place? If not, ignore it. I'll try and get that later on.
Ifia has come to the rescue yet again. She's posted the correct link in the chat.
Yes, the design features. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop posting these links because, yeah, never seems to work out for me. Thank you. Okay, your design must recognize when to use the various cloud deployment models. In many cases, organizations will need to implement a hybrid deployment. You know, that's something that we kind of mentioned earlier. So the hybrid model is said to be very common amongst organizations. So that is the hybrid being a mixture of kind of private and public. thought it was going to show an example there. But yeah, depend on the organization's requirements. So on the back of last week, managing capital expenditure, operational expenditure, strategies must exist for shifting costs between the two types of expenditures. IT budgets have historically been based on capital expenditure, so fixed costs. Like, you know, historically how much you're going to be spending on your assets per year, whereas moving forward, it's not necessarily a fixed cost. As we mentioned, one of the payment models were kind of pay as you go. Going back to the point that we raised earlier around scalability, you know, you might want to scale up, you might want to scale down, and these are kind of variable costs, if that makes sense. So not necessarily having that initial kind of upfront cost, but expanding over time. So let's look at service levels. I know this is something that we definitely raised previously. So compute, your virtual machines, network, you know, we spoke about capacity, storage, having hot, cold storage choices, you know, what is the requirements for the organization? How quickly do you need to access your assets? Staff training to ensure that those gaps of technical knowledge reduce potentially, as an example, and then technical optimization. So some applications might be cloud ready, but not all. Legacy applications may never be able to be moved to the cloud, and therefore you might have to keep some on-prem whilst others can be moved to the cloud. So something to consider. Going back to our first initial conversation around health information, these are regulatory regulations. We covered these earlier. HIPAA, looking at your health information, Sarbanes-Oxley, looking at your security controls, and PCI, looking at your payment card information. But it must be considered when doing your cloud design, you know, incorporating these features in it. Is it PCI compliant? Is it HIPAA compliant? Is it SOX compliant? And then potentially having an audit to kind of validate that. And each of these might have their own kind of specific requirements that you need to meet. Disaster mitigations. Again, I can't remember if we've kind of covered this in a previous session. But we'll look into detail now on these. Redundancy, high availability, disaster recovery, point and time objective. You know, what requirements does an organization have for these? So let's look at redundancy. 4 areas where redundancy might be useful: business processes, hardware, network, geographical. So, you know, what is the uptime for your services across your organization? Do we need to have services running at 100% all the time? What is our tolerable downtime? You know, if there's a natural disaster, we lose access to the network, you know, ultimately how would that impact the organization? What cost would that incur for the organization? Something to be considered. So business processes are a set of related tasks that result in a product or a service. Such processes may involve many systems, including inventory databases, email servers, printing, shipping. Now, if these services or any one of their constituent parts fail, then the product is not produced. May map out business processes and ensure there is no single point of failure. So single point of failure being a device or service that is not redundant. So if one single thing fails, there's no access, and that will stop business processes as soon as it fails. So if my device falls over and I don't have redundancy, I don't have a backup server that will, run as soon as one fails, single point of failure for an organization. And that might be single point of failure for hardware or software application. And this is something to also consider when thinking about cloud deployment. So if you're on-prem, there's downtime within your data center. If you now had, if you're using a SaaS service, you could essentially move to that. Just something as an example, just thinking out loud. Let's look at hardware redundancy. Ensuring no piece of hardware can bring down a service. So you've got effectively kind of two running environments there. So hardware redundancy, no single piece of hardware can bring down a service. So physical servers normally ship with two power supplies. When one fails, the other should still be functioning. Each power supply should then be connected to a different electrical circuit in the server room so that when one fails, the other one can still provide power. So as you can see in this example here, when both are good, it's good. Even when one fails, the other one's good. So you still provide power supply. Network redundancy. So network redundancies ensure that cloud service is reachable. And even if the internet fails, one example of such redundancy would be for a small business to use a cable modem based internet connection from a provider, and also a DSL based internet connection from provider B. This strategy uses two different technologies from two different providers over two different types of networks to provide internet connectivity. So just to reiterate, we've got hardware redundancy, network redundancy. Now we're looking at geographical redundancy, which is redundancy across different regions, locations. And this might be necessary during a natural disaster. I think I mentioned that earlier. If your assets go down in this location, no impact to the organization because it can then start running again from your assets based in another location. High availability. Now, this is a concept that I think is very important. So concepts being redundancy and high availability. This is always 100% effective for organizations that want, for example, 99.9% uptime. That means I'm up almost 100% all the time, no downtime. It's a critical service. And organizations just cannot afford to have any downtime. So examples of this is, banks, for example. I'm sure NHS is probably running at 99.9% uptime as well. Can't afford for their services to be down either. So high availability refers to computer systems that are likely to operate for a very long time. Generally running at about 99% for most of the year. Probably not the most cost-effective option, but for an organization that is required to be up 99.9%, it's critical to have that in place. But depending on what solution you're going for, will ultimately determine what your high availability will look like. Sorry, I'm just kind of running through these. I've run out of time. Got about 2 slides left. I'm hoping to cover these. We've got some activities, but I won't have time to cover that. Disaster recovery. So if your organization needs to be up 99.9% of the time, what is your recovery point objective and your maximum tolerable downtime? You know, how long can you tolerate for your organization to be down? So we're looking at 2 measurements here: recovery point objective, recovery time objective. So these 2 aspects, essentially the opposite to high availability, where high availability attempts to avoid downtime. So you want to be up all the time, 99.9%, whereas disaster recovery means downtime has already occurred. And the issue becomes how quickly can you restore to normal processes. And we've got 2 measurements there. So let's look at deeper into these 2. So we've got recovery point objective and recovery time objective. So recovery point objective measures the age of the files to be recovered, and you want to go back to the most recent file as possible. The recovery time objective is looking at the specific time, the period of time which services must be restored following a disaster. Okay, apologies, I'm gonna have to run through this because I have to stop bang on at 8. But again, these are just recap. This is just a recap, and we can cover anything in maybe the last minute or so that's not clear. So lastly, this is the last point that we're going to cover before we finish, which is guidelines. So guidelines might be your cloud designs, what your cloud design should leverage, and the 5 cloud characteristics, cloud designs which dictate which deployment model is used. I don't want to kind of read through all of these. There's a few points there around CapEx, OpEx, looking at cloud design, service level definitions, legal and regulatory compliance requirements, something that we covered earlier around PCI, HIPAA, which is health information. Then looking at disaster mitigation, redundancy, high availability, where they're kind of different. And those 2 measurements there, RTO and RPO, very critical for disaster recovery. And that's it. That is it for today. I've sorry, I had to run through the last few slides because I've just completely run out of time. I'm not going to go through these activities. We don't have time to go through that. But in this last minute, just wanted to provide the opportunity for anyone to ask any questions. As I mentioned at the start of the session, these sessions are just recaps. This is not meant to essentially teach you anything. All the content that you have should be enough to kind of run through things. And also utilizing the Geneva app where you can. So over to you if you have any questions. Please head off if you need to. Please show the answer. Okay, sorry. So the stakeholder also suggests that oh, sorry. That was the answer. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining this session. I know I kind of rushed through the last aspect of this course, but hopefully you still will benefit from this today. No problem, no problem. As we've been mentioning, I can't go back. Yeah, as we've been mentioning, please use these sessions to kind of ask questions, and we'll do our best to respond as best as we can. Yeah, no problem. No problem. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to, let's see. Recording.